This chapter is from a manuscript I wrote about my dad. I finished it just a few weeks before Literary El Paso went to press, so the timing was fortuitous, for me and I hope readers of the book. My dad, Chester Selzer, was a native of Cleveland, Ohio. An extremely gifted writer, he moved to El Paso and married my mother in the early 1950s. It was here that he assumed a pseudonym derived from the maiden name of my mother, Amada Muro, who was born in Chihuahua City. Chester Selzer thus became Amado Muro, a literary figure whose stories were widely read and admired. The selection from Literary El Paso deals with his life in Cleveland, before Amado Muro became Amado Muro. I call this piece The Old Man. The teenager walked up the hill, and when he reached the crest, he was on top of the world, as close to eternity as he would ever get. It was breathtaking, and there from the hilltop he took it all in, the sky above, the lake below, a broad band of silver liquid shimmering in the early morning sunlight. He had stood on this spot 100 times before, and he would stand on this spot 100 times after, but none of those experiences could rival this one moment, this one sliver of time, frozen in his memory and in his heart. And each time he talked about that morning, he described it the same way. The morning he witnessed something beautiful, something sublime, something eternal. The teenager was my father, and the lake was Lake Erie. It was part of his city, part of his life. My father loved Cleveland. I could tell. He described it as though it were his Oz, magical but real. My father called himself the Old Man, a term he intended to be both endearing and self-deprecating. But there was some truth in it. He lived in the past, reveled in its musty odor, its tenacious grip, for it refused to let go of him, and yes, he refused to let go of it. The old man gave me impromptu quizzes on mythology and ancient civilizations every day. Who was Hector? Who was Hannibal? What was the Roman name for Zeus? How many labors did Hercules perform? Where did Achilles get pierced with an arrow? But it was the Cleveland stories I loved the most, the stories from his childhood. They were the real myths, the tales freighted with humor and drama and joy. And no matter which story he related, the best character was always the town itself, big and raw and majestic, the backdrop for all his youthful adventures. The family lived in a Tudor-style house in Shaker Heights, but his real neighborhood was the town itself, all of it, from one end to another. Cleveland was not the center of his universe. Cleveland was his universe. He never expressed this thought, not directly, but he never had to. When he talked about his hometown, he was so passionate that I fantasized about my own life as a parent. Would El Paso become my Cleveland when I became a father? Would I regale my children with stories from my youth? I hope so. Before the old man became the old man, he loved to wander the streets of Cleveland, sometimes by foot, sometimes by streetcar. He saw wondrous things, and he saw horrible things. The most horrible came during the Great Depression, when mob figures were the most successful entrepreneurs in town. My father was a teenager. He stepped off the streetcar one afternoon, ready to roam the downtown he loved so much. Two men approached each other on a street corner. Both wore black, double-breasted suits, one of them with a colorful handkerchief blossoming from his coat pocket. Mr. Handkerchief stuck his arm out as if about to shake hands with the other man, but it was not a hand he was extending, it was a gun, and Mr. Handkerchief started firing. The other man collapsed to his knee, as if genuflecting. Then his upper body crashed onto the sidewalk, his head twisting as it hit the concrete. Mr. Handkerchief walked away, briskly but casually. My father saw the murder and he vomited, and years later, when he recounted the story, you could sense the horror and the bile coming back. That was the scariest story he ever told me, but it was not the most traumatic. Before my father could become an old man, he had to become a young man, and the transition from childhood to manhood, rough and unexpected, occurred one afternoon in a downtown diner. It was during the Great Depression. Why did all his memorable times happen during hard times? He met his best friend, Whitey Bimlap, and the two boys walked the streets without purpose. But then, that was their purpose. For the greatest freedom was to act without having to act, to move without having to move. The two boys, cherishing their youthful liberty, stopped at a diner on Euclid Avenue. The place was packed, but they found two empty stools at the counter, a spot sandwiched between two hulks who burrowed into their food like earth movers. My father and Whitey were starving, but their appetites were bigger than their pocketbooks, much bigger. They were penniless, but Whitey had a plan. When they finished their meals, my father a hamburger, his friend a grilled cheese sandwich, Whitey jumped off the stool, retching and groaning. He bent over, his head nearly scraping the floor, a pathetic figure folded in half, like a flower with a weak stem. Then he started screaming. She, he stammered, pointing at the young waitress behind the counter. She spit on my sandwich. I saw her. The manager rushed out from the kitchen. What seems to be the problem, he asked. She spit on my sandwich, Whitey screamed, still groaning. Okay, you two fellows can go on now, the manager said, escorting them to the door. Then they heard him scream at the young waitress. And you, he said, you're fired. Just like that, she was gone, and with barely a shred of evidence. The manager led two boys, one a pint-sized Paul Muni, the other his silent accomplice, rage, fume, and plot their way out of paying a meal. Whitey feigned illness, but when they hit the sidewalk, my father felt truly sick, his heart burdened by the injustice he helped perpetrate. The two teenagers conspired their way into a free meal, but they cost an innocent woman her job in the process. Was she a single mother? Was she taking care of a handicapped aunt? Was she working her way to a better life in California? My father would never know. The young woman was a mystery, a nameless victim. My father never told me this, and it is impossible to extrapolate a lifetime of dedication from a moment of guilt. But the incident led to his social conscience. I know it did. It must have. Try not to have it fun at the expense of other people, he told me, finishing his tale. How will I know, he asked. You'll know, he said.